Hello, everyone. This is Cody Lee of BlackCatBooks.org, author of I, the Dragon, Cool and Beautiful Rabbit Hole, Lore and Frey, and the upcoming Jaw the Dragon. I have been thinking a lot lately about how I want to cover like The Last of Us HBO, because of course I'm not going to watch it. I'm not going to watch like the newest port of The Last of Us on a streaming service with all of with all of the walking sections pulled out and with only the cutscenes remaining. I'm not interested in watching The Last of Us with even less gameplay, essentially. So I've been kind of thinking about like, well, how do I want to talk about this? Am I going to talk about The Last of Us again? Am I going to talk about how it's like one of the most overrated games that he ever made? Am I going to make fun of people for like pretending it had like some crazy plot twist? Some crazy ending? Am I gonna like talk about like people like Angry Joe who are just grifting when they say it's like one of the best games they've ever played? Like, are there things to talk about? Well, no. I do think there's one very specific thing that I think people aren't talking about is that The Last of Us will not be the best video game adaptation of 2023. That is an interesting thing to talk about because we've kind of moved past the point of like talking about game of the year because Nintendo's winning game of the year every year. Like they have since like every year since the 90s. It's not really up in the air as to like what the best games coming out on the best platforms are. The only people who are in denial about this are paid sponsors and shills, right? The only people who said The Last of Us was better than something like say the Wonderful 101 are people who don't play video games, right? What we're seeing now is that these people who have spent the past decade trying to turn video games into movies, bringing people like Al Pacino on stage to try and shill Christopher Judge as like the voice of Kratos, the guys who pushed like God of War to go in this more cinematic direction, the fact that like, Days Gone, all these like Last of Us clones, like being movie games, right? The David Cages, the phenomenon of Sony exclusives just being walking simulator movies from people who couldn't make it in Hollywood. That has resulted in its natural conclusion where these people who want to make movies are, in fact, producing movies or at the very least TV shows. We've heard a lot. The Uncharted movie got released. Like there was a Sly Cooper movie in production at one point. There was a Ratchet and Clank movie that came out that everybody has forgotten about. And now we have like The Last of Us, The Last of Us TV series in which people like Angry Joe right now are trying to say, holy shit, it's just like the game. The characters kneel down and look at their backpacks exactly the way they do in the game. It's so ridiculous. It's so transparent. It's so fake. I can't help but like shake my head at it. Like I don't want to come out and say that like this is worse than like Castlevania because what could possibly be worse than Castlevania? Castlevania's problem was that like it was nothing like the source material. The Last of Us's problem seems to be that it's exactly the same thing. The Last of Us fundamentally was not a very good zombie movie. Like people will try to tell you that it's like one of the best stories ever told, but in reality, it's a generic blockbuster Hollywood film that would have been forgotten honestly not even a month after release, if it ever gotten any traction at all. There was nothing about The Last of Us that was particularly innovative or special, from a filmmaking perspective. It would not have left a dent in the filmmaking industry. The only reason it got any attention at all was because Sony was at the height of their powers of like tricking audiences into thinking they were like cutting edge, innovative cinematography, just film auteurs, like these playable movies, right? The only reason. If it was an actual film, it would never have gotten any attention at all. So what we're going to see in the next year or so is that we're going to see The Last of Us, HBO, compete with the Super Mario Bros. Movie. The Super Mario Bros. Movie, which is like an animated film that seems to really take all the aspects that everybody loves about Mario and creates a new, interesting, innovative experience with it. This is not a copy-paste job of a specific Mario plot or like rehashing something we've seen before. This is something new, interesting, and innovative, like featuring the characters that we love. You know, we get to see Mario go up against Donkey Kong. We're seeing Bowser take on these penguins. We're seeing like Mario traversing obstacle courses. We're seeing like, you know, cheap bridges in real time. We're seeing like, you know, Toad Towns. We're seeing like these moving platforms. We're seeing like all these creatures, you know, Koopa Troopas, Kamek, you know, Bowser forming an army. Like you get all this stuff that's in the games, but has been adapted into a film, its own original thing that suits the medium it's in. I think that's why the Mario movie is going to stop the Last of Us HBO, because The Last of Us is just a carbon copy of what we've seen before, while the Mario movie, much like the entire franchise up to this point, since 1981, you know, over 40 years ago, with the original Donkey Kong, has grown and evolved and done new things constantly. The Last of Us was not new the day it came out. Okay? It was a cheap knockoff of like countless other superior titles that were even on the same platform, let's be fair. Like the PS3 was not lacking in games like The Last of Us, okay? Mario is the defining video game classic that is being converted for the second time onto film, for the first time well. Imagine if I, you know, was sitting here, you know, in the 90s telling you that like, the live action Super Mario Bros. Movie is going to be going to stomp The Last of Us. No, nobody would have done that. Nobody likes that movie, right? That's what The Last of Us fans are doing right now. You know, they are telling you that The Last of Us HBO is the greatest thing ever because it's a new PlayStation product. You know, that's the only reason why they're hyping this up. It's because it gives them something to talk about until the next major AAA movie game gets produced. Like, I'm so disgusted at like the sheer amount of people who still refuse to shut up about The Last of Us, who still insist this is one of the best stories in gaming, that this IP has like any hope of like growing or evolving or doing something unique or different, like utilizing these characters in new unique situations. It isn't going to happen. Not only did it not happen in The Last of Us Part 2, The Last of Us Part 2 should have dashed any hope for this franchise going forward, period. You know, The Last of Us Part 2 should have been seen as a franchise killer, and yet here we are seeing an adaptation, a live-action adaptation that nobody asked for, you know, awaiting the release of, like, The Last of Us multiplayer, like, whatever they're calling it, which, let's be real here, should have been a part of The Last of Us Part 2. You know, like, why exactly they cut out the multiplayer in The Last of Us Part 2 to sell it as its own product, I do not know. Probably to keep interest in the brand alive. It's embarrassing. I don't know. This is, I think, a product that has no real momentum behind it. Unlike Cyberpunk Edge Runners, in which I think there were a legit like number of people who like enjoyed the anime and kind of went back to Cyberpunk 2077 and like maybe enjoyed it. Like, I think The Last of Us Part 2, the hype around this is even less than that, honestly. Like, I think there's really no enthusiasm for this at all. Like, the only people I'm seeing talking about The Last of Us are, like, the big gaming YouTube channels who are probably, let's be real here, shilling and, like, trying to promote a brand. Like, trying to get, like, people to watch their channels, right? We've seen this pattern with Angry Joe over the past couple of years, where he's just watching all these terrible shows that people absolutely hate. Stuff like, you know, Rings of Power, House of Dragons, Game of Thrones Season 8, She-Hulk. Like, these shows that are, like, universally reviled, that are having all these problems. like very early on in production, like before the show even airs, right? Everyone knows they're going to bomb, but like Joe comes up, oh, I'm a big YouTuber and I think this looks great. Oh, I'm really looking forward to this. I bet it's going to be great. If you don't think so, you're not a real fan. I don't know exactly how he handled the She-Hulk thing because I think he liked like the first episode, right? He gave it like a positive reaction. The reason he does that is so he can do this thing where he watches the show for a brief period of time, and then like around episode 5 or 6, like he starts like being down on it and starts like agreeing with the critics, and like this is how his attempts at trying to play both ways, right? Of like placating the hardcore fanboys while like while still like appeasing his corporate shareholders and the people who control him behind the scenes. People like Jeff Keighley, the people who control Jeff Keighley, the big names in the gaming industry who want you to like be buying crap for the rest of your life. That's what we're seeing here. I it's kind of interesting seeing the same people who are criticizing The Last of Us. Oh, I'm sorry, the Mario movie. People who cannot stop complaining about Mario's voice, like getting excited about The Last of Us. Like this really is, I think, a product that has no real excitement behind it. But these guys are going to keep hyping it up anyway, and I think they're going to keep hyping it up until the show ends, and they have to move on to the next big thing because when you get right down to it, that's all that these people ever do.